Доброго дня.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Topic of our next briefing is 100 days of the new parliament. Who tries to hinder the reform agenda? We have Yaroslav Yurchyshyn, then is Kovryzhenko, Yuriy Ganushchak, and Oleksandr Banchuk from RPR, and Andriy Kruglashov, Andriy from CHESNO movement. I'm Yaroslav Yurchyshyn. I'm manager on advocacy of RPR. And today I will present you a situation, how we see it in the anti-corruption reform and in public administration reform. We have united, there's two topics because we believe that we should not just check the existent corruption scheme and also create preconditions for effective anti-corruption activities. In this context, we will speak with Mr. Ganushchak. In anti-corruption, we may point out strong progress made in direction of establishing National Anti-Corruption Bureau. This was made to implement the coalition agreement. And this work on establishing Anti-Corruption Bureau proves that the progress has been made, but there is a huge pressure, and there are attempts to change the procedure for anti-corruption head appointment, and thus we observe that there are artificial hinders made from outside. Of course, Anti-Corruption Bureau could not be perfect. The law on Anti-Corruption Bureau is not perfect, but it is passed, it is voted, it should be implemented. Another positive moment is that accountability for public finance became more transparent and more stronger. Currently, there is the rule that all public finance expenses should be placed on one website, and thus public will be able to get it from one source. One more good news is that the resolution on e-governance was passed, and the law was passed about publication of open data, which will promote implementation of a governance further. Here again we say that the civil experts, civil society experts were heard, and these reforms which I have just mentioned, they are making progress. On the other hand, the new law on civil service, which was drafted with assistance from the international experts and submitted to the Cabinet of Ministers. Unfortunately, it was not passed, and it is hampered somewhere in the Cabinet of Ministers, and each time when we approach to them on this issue, they promise to do this some next day. That is, neither changes as to the central executive bodies or the law on the civil service is not entered to the parliament. That is, we are lagging behind with the agenda, reform agenda in this area. Speaking about law enforcement, we give the floor to Oleksandr Banchuk, and he will describe what's going on in the law enforcement sphere. Speaking about law enforcement sector, I would mention the Ministry of the Interior and the Prosecutor's Office. On the one hand, in the Ministry of the Interior, they are making some progress. They are now establishing a new patrol service in Kyiv. They are selecting new candidates. They have introduced psychological tests for them. And thus, from mid-June, this new patrol service will start to function. The ministry promised that they will introduce similar services in all big cities in Ukraine by the end of this year, while from 2016 similar patrol service will act throughout all the territory of Ukraine. Nevertheless, my expectation is that at least by summer, Kyivans will see this reform implemented. On the other hand, the law on police is not passed, and this hampers the police reform. That is, since we have no such thing as police in our legislation, despite the fact that our government officials promised to adopt this novelty. Although there are two draft laws on police, but and we offered these two draft laws to the Ministry of the Interior, but they did not want to take it. So they rejected two draft laws prepared by the experts and civic activists, and they started drafting their own law. And the second issue, on the prosecutor's office. In mid-October last year, a new draft law on the prosecutor's office was passed. It was positively assessed by European experts and the Venice Commission. But unfortunately, within 5 months, Prosecutor General and his team did nothing to implement this law. And actually, now we have to establish some 200 local prosecutors' officers, and this new leadership of the prosecutor's office, which was appointed recently, they have to postpone establishing this local prosecutors' officers. And they promised to be ready with this assignment by mid-July. And because of this delay and postponement, many provisions of the newly passed law cannot be enforced. The Prosecutor General understands how complex this issue is, and he promised that selection to this prosecutor's offices will be made public, and he promised that very soon we will feel changes in this sphere. I am Yuriy Ganushchak, expert on decentralization.
Yes, there is something positive and there are some threats, challenges, and among positive things. So I would like to mention the law on assemblies, voluntary assemblies. It opens opportunities there to run administration reforms, and the law on basics of regional policy. So we move from hand manual administration of budgets and transfers to regions to planned work. And if such policy of the government will continue, it will be so balanced, and then there will be opportunities for access to have access to European structures, funds, and at least they do that in Moldova. And for 4 years, they are working on the legislative field, which is closer to European, and they get money and quite big money for regional projects. In that sense, I have to mention that our government was slow. Only now they started to prepare draft regulations, but it's because the last parliament didn't pass the basic laws. I would like to mention a big positive influence of changes to the budget code and in the part of fiscal decentralization that stimulates a reform of administrative territorial system. But also there are some challenges. If it's clear with basic level, now there are processes in the regions how to develop their plans, prospect plans, negotiations between local self-governance bodies about merger. So there is a big problem, issue which is discussed, the issue of sub-regional level. According to the concept of the reform of decentralization of power, that must be orientation to districts, and then will come to 120 sub-regional units of some kind of new rayon districts, and also there is a process in strategy is difficult, and the prosecution has its own decision, so we don't have synchronized work in that direction. One more threat, that is time. We don't fit the schedule, we are behind it, because in autumn there must be local elections if we want to see a reform. So by that time there should be voluntary merging of towns and cities settlements. So it was not observed that it is taking place. So this is the issue of the constitution. In the constitution there is one point which will be very practically will be very difficult to approve amendments and as to decentralization until our elite doesn't agree. So if we have some of the same problems like we had during the time of Yanukovych or Yushchenko, who runs representatives of the state on the territories, and in that case we can bury that reform. We are prepared the amendments to the constitution, we prepared the best variant, but now the issue is it's up to politicians. Also one challenge, we don't see a manifestive step from the parliament and the government which would show that decentralization is serious. I mean changes to the law on Kiev as to separation of powers between the head of Kiev administration and a mayor. If that law will not be adopted, then we cannot seriously speak about say that that politicians are interested in decentralization. Thank you. Kovryzhenko, I represent also the Reanimation Package of Reforms and the International Foundation of Electoral Systems. I would like to share my thoughts about how they implement one of the more important directions from the coalition agreement. There's the reform of the election law. Unfortunately, despite the fact that the election law reform is probably the cheapest, there are no changes in that field. The coalition agreement gives clear dates that regulate elections. So parliamentary election law must be passed in the first half year in 2015 and the local elections in the first quarter of this year. We see that the quarter is almost over, but there is no progress here. The same in concerns many other initiatives related to the electoral reform, like reducing the number of local councils. What are the main reasons of such slow progress? First of all, politicians don't have a clear understanding how they want to see themselves. So all are trying to test, to fit the election system to themselves and to now, so they debate, though in coalition agreement it says the system according to which to hold elections open list in parliamentary and local levels. Now there are some exotic ideas as to what open lists to be used, in which elections politicians say that must be open lists, but it's better to close them a little bit, or they consider proportional system with open list only in that context, because the list is published in mass media. That means that is open. And now among many political parties there is no understanding. There is no understanding about open list and how the system is used in many other countries. There are some groups of influence. If to take local election system, there is the role of the parliamentary committee on justice. The speaker has initiatives, and he set up a group which is related to the committee, but it is integrated in the committee, and there are some efforts of the administration of the president committee, which was working on that issue before, the issue of local governance and state building, to work on reform of local elections. As a result, we have not just chaos, but different centers to develop decisions, to prepare decisions. So that's why it's very difficult to be on the same page. And as to parliamentary elections, the situation is not the best, because there are some ideas that it's better to the new. We should come later to this law, because parliamentary elections are not something which is timely. So they registered some initiatives in the parliament related to the introduction of open list, and one of them is quite closely. One of those initiatives, 68 to concept of the reform of election to the parliament developed by IPR. But again, we don't see any development of these initiatives, and among politicians there is no common understanding. Just because we are trying to make them aware, but there's a problem. We speak to representatives of NGO and journalists and organizations that belong to the RPR. They start regional trips, and the main parameters of reforms of election reforms will be explained to politicians and experts.
Good afternoon. My name is Pavlo Meron. I'm an analyst from CHESNO movement, civic movement. Our colleagues from RPR presented you what was developed. We will present you with the results of our surveys and observations. This Verkhovna Rada convocation is unique. Unique since there is one vacant place. This is a vacant place of the opposition, and we have analyzed how many initiatives were supported by this very bloc. Out of 700 initiatives, they have supported 20 of them, and there are only the Will of People group and the Renaissance groups, which partially put forward some initiatives. There is no obvious conflict between the president and the prime minister, as we observed in the times of Tymoshenko. BPP and Petro Poroshenko bloc and the People's Front factions vote almost in coordination. Samopomych faction is in more critical position. They have an intention to criticize, and probably this is Samopomych party which actually takes opposition's position. We have observed that a group of majority members of parliament from Kharkiv Oblast, which tried to be extremely independent from the current authorities after escape of Yanukovych, they almost coordinate they are almost in accordance with the opposition bloc. And this is about Samopomych, a big part of independent members of parliament, non-partisan members of parliament. They join this faction when they want to criticize the ruling course. Also, all members of Svoboda party who entered parliament not through party lists, but because Svoboda was not elected, but through majority constituencies, and they joined this group too. We haven't found any logic in voting positions of Transcarpathian members of parliament like Baloga. But they tend to coincide in opinions and voting with Batkivshina party. Pro-presidential and pro-prime ministerial factions tend to vote in more coordinated way, but Petro Poroshenko's faction is less disciplined in as a party than People's Front faction. And in general, People's Front faction looks more consolidated in terms of party discipline. I'm Kruglashov Andriy, coordinator from CHESNO movement. I support Pavlo. There are issues which could be viewed differently from different points of view, but compliance with the constitution and compliance with the procedure of the parliament, these are unconventional things, and unfortunately we observe this shameful phenomenon of non-personal voting. in Rada, when members of parliament press buttons for their colleagues who are absent at the parliamentary sitting. That's why several members of parliament have entered 1895 draft law, which suggests that members of parliament will be deprived from their right of participation in parliamentary sessions and in participation in international delegations because they pressed buttons or somebody pressed buttons for them. Some members of parliament come to the parliament and do not register themselves, or they do not arrive to the parliament and ask their colleagues to register them as present. That's why we believe that if attendance of the sittings is not improved, then probably we'll apply the same rule as in the local parliaments. If the parliament attends less than 50% of sittings per month, then it should be deprived from the right of the member of parliament. That's why we suggest that this draft law number 1895 should be passed in the parliament. We request to add transparency to the parliamentary work. The members of parliament are obliged to ensure implementation of the speaker's decision that each committee has to publish transcripts of his sittings, audio records of his sittings, and also minutes of his sitting. Only this way we would be able to cope with this improper procedure in Rada. This is unfortunately only one committee on international policy which complies fully with this requirement of the speaker and resolution of the speaker.
Dear colleagues, briefly I would like to inform you that a broader report and a discussion on how coalition agreement is compliant with and the government of the program of the government, you will have a chance to have it on March 20 during the forum of control check of implementation of coalition agreement. We invite international experts and our civic partners and representatives of all the authorities. I hope that they will not be afraid to show up. Now you have a chance to ask any question to the experts here. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting assessment. Is there any question? Okay, I have a question. You commented several reforms, but there are more reforms. Do you have a progress or regress as to other reforms? Every sector of life in Ukraine demands reforms. We selected those in addition to economic when we needed to have a serious discussion about that, and we will speak about those reforms separate. Those institutional reforms, in addition to the constitutional one, which are very important and which cover all fields of life of our country. They touch all spheres of life, and there is a discussion to which extent we have judicial reform, because on one hand they passed a very good organizing decision, logistic decisions as to how to organize the work of courts and how to make it more efficient to comply with the recommendations of our international partners, but they didn't comply with one of the norms, and like political independence of judges. So a reduction of the role of the president of the parliament, but appointment, movement, and other influence on courts. So the reform is taking place, but to which extent it meets our needs, this is a question for discussion. As to the constitutional reform, it's a pity that the promise given by all representatives of the post that reforms will be systemic. There will be systemic reforms to the constitution. No, they don't comply with that. And in the end of the first quarter, 2015, we have only just a procedure to build a constitutional committee by the president to introduce amendments to the constitution, but a serious recharge, reloading of the country is possible when the main law of the country is updated. There are some other fields and which are omitted, like reform of media and public broadcasting. There is it's a positive thing, and we hope that very soon there will be they will finish legal support of this reform, and we will come to the stage of implementation and realization. There are some technical things. It's very difficult to call them reforms, but they show that such things are possible, and they are positive because it's a reform, as they say, it's something painful. For example, competition to introduce 3G. In APR, that was also our initiative. It's difficult to call it a reform, but as such step, it's beneficial to the budget, and it allows to turn our communication into a more developed level, and to satisfy the needs of the citizens. And so in every sector, they make some steps. There's one problem which unites or goes through all the sectors, and it's a very weak communication, especially executive branch of the government, between the government and the president, and as to introduction of reforms. Instead of publications, looking at public as partners and the national groups as partners, they take us differently, and some kind of unclear amendments they suggest. So a broader analysis is on our website, and by different. You can find information about the different reforms, and as to economy, which is very important because deregulation, reform of taxes, and which should provide enough resources for all the reforms. We will have a separate briefing because this is a very complicated issue. Thank you very much. Here's a question in English.
In English, I hope you can hear me. My name is Rolf. I work with the SMMU. I have, I think, a very basic question. Which body or bodies are responsible, both within Parliament and within the government, of tracking and guiding reforms? A lot of what I hear about reforms comes from civil activists, comes from CSO representatives, and so forth. And as a follow-up to that, if these bodies do exist formally, how come they are not held accountable? Thank you.
Дуже дякую. Thank you very much. Honestly, there is a body. Unfortunately, it was created by the administration of the president, and it doesn't meet at the level of control over reforms. But what is positive? They unite all the representatives of the government, but they don't invite civic activists. We cannot complain because in the National Council of Reforms, that's what I mentioned, we have a representative from our group. There is an expert from Reanimation Package of Reforms, but in general, there are only 3 NGO representatives for the whole National Council on Reforms that demonstrates the attitude of the executive branch to civic organizations, and so we look like younger partners. It's great to hear to them, but it's not necessary to take them seriously. But I disagree that the initiative of reforms start only on the level of NGOs. I disagree with that. reform on decentralizations, yes, there were NGO involved, but the main engine of the government, there was a vice prime minister on in the previous government, and now she's the speaker of the parliament, and that's why the reform in that field, despite its complication, it can be one of the most successful. And introduction of e-governance. And Deputy Dmytro Shimkin, Deputy Presidential Administration, is responsible for that. So there's very good cooperation there. And now they brought to the parliament a legislation to introduce e-democracy, elements of e-democracies, which allow citizens, when they unite, they can influence on the agenda of the government. For our government is something, like from the moon. And these draft laws are developed with NGO activists, and our people are working on that, but the main promoter is Dmytro Shimkin, who is responsible in presidential administration for introduction of reforms, for running of the reforms. As a place, National Council of Reform, it's a very good idea to have such a ground, but under the condition of a broader involvement of NGOs, of the civic sector, not only on the level of National Council, but on the level of strategic teams, focused teams. They could be created by the ministers. We, as representative of NGO, we sent proposals to all the ministers to include our representatives into their teams to place, and we have answers from some ministries, like from healthcare, but from Ministry of Economy, we don't have an answer, and so there's a danger that the reform in that extremely important sector, there could be reforms, but without any opinion of civic sector.
And one more thing, as our infographics demonstrates, our authorities try to postpone the old way of doing things. They try to exist in parallel with civil society. They try to do some reforming and then present the effort to broad public. And in this case, they focus on things which they think are important, while civil society has other focus. Who are representing RPR in that National Council of Reform? Dmytro Koval is representing our initiative. Hanna Hopko cannot represent our organization. She's our partner, but she cannot represent us because she is a member of parliament. And I have a question. What is your plans for future big analytical projects? I mean, when do you plan to analyze the work of the parliament in general? We try to take more systemic approach and analyze not just the work of the parliament, but also the coordinated work between the parliament, the government, and the president. Actually, we do not have triangular here. We have rectangular here, because the fourth corner here, this is civil society. And next time, on March 20th, we will have a special forum devoted to the analysis of the pace of reform. And later on, we will periodically track implementation of the coalition agreement, because I believe that for civil society, this is a good benchmark to check and to inspect the progress of the government on the way of reforms. I would add to this analysis on behalf of CHESNO movement. We observe work of the parliament on daily and weekly basis, but after second session in summer, we will be ready to provide a more deep analysis of their work. How do you assess the stack with time schedule, whether our members of parliament will stack with timelines which they have established in the coalition agreement in terms of reforms? Well, our assessments show that they have reached different level of progress in different spheres. There are some spheres where they implemented almost 35% of what they have planned, or 17% of what they have made, while there is a sphere, the constitutional reform, where they are only thinking about implementation. With our partners from UCIPR, we are thinking about a special survey which will present how the government and or the authorities in general are implementing their promises